Okay, welcome back. This is, of course, Professor TOVANCHE, and as you can see, today we're going to talk about, what has become known as the quote-unquote new Negro. So we ended last time by talking a little bit about the World War One and the effects and Great Migration and so forth, right? So the Great Migration is going to have a variety of effects and a tremendous effect on the country and, of course, Black people themselves. We know that people from across the country of all sorts, they're coming and living in cities, mostly in the north. People from across the country and around the world are actually thrown together. They find themselves in these urban settings. They're dealing with people they otherwise would never have encountered and never had to deal with. They're finding themselves working in similar situations, right? They're competing for jobs, they're competing for housing, they're competing for social status. Of course, Black people are going to be relegated to the lower rungs of society. Generally, they're going to have the lower jobs with the lesser pay and the worst working conditions. And we're talking about conditions that are even poor by the standards of the time. They're going to be segregated with regard to housing. They're going to be pushed into these little ghetto areas that they're going to be called later on. These areas are going to be sketchier. They're going to be marked with crime and poverty, substance abuse and use. They're going to be, that is, Black people thought of as substandard citizens. But despite this, or maybe because of this, in a sense, Black people will forge a new world for themselves. They will form this new sort of urban identity, a sense of Black collectivism, and a new sense of determination, a determination that will involve a desire to be included, but sometimes a desire to be separated. And a lot of this, of course, will flow from their growing sense of racial pride. By the early 1900s, by 1920, the new Negro, has arrived. Now, when we talk about the new Negro, we're talking about people who are characterized by racial pride, determination, a sense of agency, not just determination, but self-determination, being able to determine for yourself your own future. That's agency, recall. These people don't want to be taken for granted. They don't want to be taken for granted by politicians who will pander to their vote. Vote for me, and I will do for you. And then, of course, you don't. Woodrow Wilson did that, right? Woodrow Wilson, in fact, becomes president in 1912, pandering, talking about race issues. And in fact, Black people vote for him. Black men, I should say, vote for him in large numbers. For the very first time, they're switching over Black people from the Republican Party to the Democratic Party. Woodrow Wilson was a Democrat. They give him the huge portion of their vote, but then he basically turns their back on them. So they're thinking at this point, we don't want to be taken for granted by politicians. We don't want to be taken for granted by employers who exploit our position, right? Not only giving us the worst jobs and the worst sorts of conditions and so forth, but often using us as scabs in order to break strikes of white men, white workers. These people are saying we cannot be taken for granted and we must contribute to our own future through politics, especially voting, and of course, through economics, fair work. They want fair work. They want fair wages. They want fair prices when they go to the store. Very often in their neighborhoods, you're going to see higher prices for goods, services, and food. They say, we don't want to be taken for granted this way anymore. So we want the fair work. We want fair prices. We want inclusion in unions. We want Black-owned businesses. What we want is equality. That is what the new Negro demands. And this idea of a new Negro, the new Negro, is promoted by Black scholars, by activists, by Black intellectuals, especially like this guy named Alain Locke. You'll see more of him. Make sure you read him in your book. But men like him, they want to shine light on the Black condition. They actually want to shine light on the causes of the status of Black people. Why is it that Red Summer happened? What was the cause of racial violence? They want to look at poverty. What causes that? Incarceration of Black men. What causes that? Low rates of education. What causes that? So they're investigating the reality of it, These things exist. There's a higher poverty level, a higher incarceration level, and a lower rate of education among Black people. And so they're looking at the causes for this and the reality of it, the Black condition. Now, this way of looking at things really mirrors what is known as critical race theory. You may have heard of this. It's been in the news quite a bit. Especially, I listen to a lot of conservative talk radio. They're all over this thing. They can, first of all, they misunderstand critical race theory, or if they do understand it, they intentionally distort what it means. Here is really what critical race, and of course, you got to be careful with definitions, but this is basically, I think most critical race theorists and most scholars would agree that the way critical race theory is portrayed by its opponents is not really critical race theory. Critical race theory is simply a study. It's a theory that prompts you to look at the intersection of race and every aspect of society. To use race as a prism, a way to look at something, to consider the position of races and the differences among races. For example, critical race theory is used to look at the difference in income. Why is it? Why is it that Black people, even today, have lower levels of wealth and lower levels of income than white people? Why is that? Well, we have to look at the history, and we have to look at the systemic racism of the past, and then we have to talk about the possibility that systemic racism exists today. And I say possibility tongue in cheek because I don't think there's much doubt among scholars that it does in fact exist. But we look at, for example, when I say we, I'm really talking about critical race theorists, they look at, disparities in income and wealth through the prism of race. They look at mortality rates of babies. Why is it that Black babies are more likely to die before white babies when they, before they reach the age of 2? In either respect. Why is that? Well, you must look at the surrounding circumstances of the mother and so forth. So a lot of those times, those things revolve around race. They look at cancer survival rates. Why is it that white people survive cancer more often than Black people? Well, there is a disparity, of course, in health insurance. Health insurance, of course, is given, is provided by jobs, and the better job you have, the more likely you're going to have health insurance. Well, historically, Black people have been actually left out of those jobs and therefore left out of the benefits of a good health plan. Now, we're talking generalizations here, right? Why is it also that Black people seem to die more often, not just from cancer, but from medical mistakes? What is it? There's a lot of theory about this. It might be that Black patients themselves aren't very forthright with white doctors. It may be that white doctors look at Black people a certain way and therefore don't ask all the right questions. These are the questions that critical race theorists ask. You can maybe start to answer these for yourself, but these are the questions that they ask. Also, why is it, again, that when it comes to the level of education, white people tend to have higher levels of education as a whole than do Black folk? So that is critical race theory in a nutshell, a very rough sort of sketch of it. And so they didn't call it critical race theory back in the 1920s, but that's kind of what we're looking at here. When we look at people like Alain Locke and others, they're going to be looking at how society actually reflects, the makeup of society reflects our racial attitudes. And people like Alain Locke and others, they're going to form organizations dedicated to bringing to light the obstacles that exist to Black uplift. They want to bring to light the Black struggles and their aspirations for success, their inclusion in U.S. society, but they also want to talk about the obstacles that are hindering that success, hindering their inclusion in U.S. society. And by and large, these organizations are not just bringing to light the obstacles and the struggles and aspirations, they're also promoting these ideas of racial equality, integration. They're trying to improve the lives of Black folk. In fact, organizations that are dedicated to Black freedom and this idea of a new Negro, the uplift, they become larger. And new ones form. For example, here we have guy named James Weldon Johnson. He will be the first black secretary of the NAACP. The NAACP, as we said, had already been formed, but by the 1920s, it's actually starting to boom. Johnson is going to be the first black secretary of the NAACP. I think I said that, but the point is, remember, the NAACP began as a white black organization. Johnson is going to promote a national sense of blackness. He's not going to just be about regional stuff. He wants a national sense. And in fact, he embarks on a national campaign to recruit members. And the result of all of this is that, he's going to bring in a lot of people and a lot of black folk. The NAACP becomes overwhelmingly black by about the 1920s. Now, it still includes white folk. And it still includes this idea that people must work across racial lines with each other. But it's very, very much about promotion of black rights and by black people. The sense that there has to be a national sense of blackness that will, in fact, gel in this community and in this organization, and that they will together advance their interests along with white allies helping them out. Now, this national campaign, of course, must include the South. But we know that in the South, it's very, very dangerous for black people, especially for outspoken black people, especially, of course, for people who are members of who want to be members of the NAACP. In the South, some chapters are very short-lived. They get set up, but they are subject to intimidation, violence, even killing of members. Now, we're going to see more of this later. The point here is that it starts already by the 1920s. You're seeing the sense of blackness. It's a national sort of movement. And what they're trying to do is focus on using the existing structures of government to promote black success. And what they're not looking to do is overthrow stuff. They don't want to overthrow anything. These are not radicals. These are people who are saying, we will use cooperation with white people. We will cooperate with white leaders. We will cooperate with the white establishment. We will use the courts that are there. We're not going to try to burn stuff down. We're going to use the courts. And we will talk more about this later, because the NAACP will become instrumental in many Supreme Court decisions down the road. So they're talking about cooperation. They're talking about using the instruments of power that exist, like the courts. They're also lobbying Congress. They want Congress to change laws. I'll just give you an example. Already in the 1920s, they're pushing for a federal law against lynching, a federal anti-lynching law. Now, this law doesn't happen. It never happens. Why? Because powerful Southern congressmen block it every time. Southern congressmen. Conservative Democrats. Keep an eye on this, right? Because what we're seeing is this Southern push and a Democratic push. But as I said, eventually the parties switch sides. The anti-lynching bill never becomes law. The NAACP, though, as I said, is going to be one of these organizations that is going to be wanting to deal with white folk at arm's length, so to speak, and to use those tools that are already available to everyone. And it's a national sort of organization, unlike the National Urban League. Although it has the word national in its title, the National Urban League is pretty well regional. It opens its headquarters in Chicago, and it opens after the Bloody Summer of 1919 that rocked the city. Remember the whole incident with the beach and the kid getting stoned and then drowning, right? Well, in 1919, after 1919, the National Urban League, notice the equal sign. That was their symbol, equality. Of course, this is often used today by people in the LGBTQ, community. So we have these people using, the symbol of equality back in the day. Anyway, they come together, these Urban League members, and they boycott businesses that won't hire black folk. They put pressure on schools to provide job training for black folk. So they want businesses to hire them, schools to educate them. And of course, they're lobbying the local city government. They want the local city government to provide better sanitation services, better police protection. And, back in the day, in the 1920s, cops are pretty darn crooked, especially because of the Prohibition era, which I really wish I had more time to go into. I was looking for a video on Prohibition. I haven't quite found one that I really think the 1920s are fascinating. I'm fascinated by Al Capone and mob culture and all that kind of cool stuff. So the Urban League is doing a variety of things, but it's not a national group. It's really concerned with Black people of Chicago, and it actually establishes a commission to look into the issue of Blackness and the Black condition in Chicago in particular. It establishes the Chicago Commission on Race Relations after the race riots of 1919. And so you can see that there are Black members, there are white members, and what this commission is supposed to do is seek to understand the causes of racial violence in Chicago. Now, behind all of this, how are they seeking to understand? Well, behind all of this is a new form of scholarship. This new scholarship is going to investigate the place of the new Negro in U.S. life. It's going to use sociology and history and studies and anthropology, right? And really, they're going to very much, especially the Chicago Commission on Race Relations, the Urban League, it's going to, in fact, emphasize sociological interpretations of problems facing Black folk. The Chicago Commission will conduct various sociological analyses of the problems facing Black people. And these theories are based on the idea of sociology developed at the University of Chicago, known as the Chicago School. The Chicago School of Sociology emphasizes environmental causes for social problems. Now, if you look at sociology, it's the study of society, right, very generally. And some sociologists would say, well, some of these things, and they had said so for a very long time, that the condition of society is in fact comes from the biology of the individual. Well, the Chicago School says no. We will emphasize environmental causes to actually explain poverty, to explain drug use and abuse, to explain crime, to explain low levels of education. These things are not things that are born unto people. They're not born with them, but they are, if you are raised amid poverty and drugs and crime, and amongst people who have been denied an education, then you're more likely than not going to be that kind of person. Now, there's always the exception, of course, but then you're going to be asking all of these people growing up within these situations to be exceptional. Not everybody's exceptional. Everybody thinks they are. I think most people think they are, but very few people are truly exceptional. The thing is, this sociological analysis that is promoted by the Chicago School, it's very anti-social Darwinistic. It's decidedly anti-social Darwinism. Remember, social Darwinism talked about your inherent being. In fact, your inherent biology being the what will dictate your position in society. If you are successful, then it is because there is something right with you, your genes, your people. Now, they didn't really know much about genes, but they know, as I said before, that people will usually be like their parents, right? They look like them, they act like them, you get the point. They said this is, in fact, something that you're born with. Success genes or poverty genes, I suppose, to put it, not put it kind of roughly. But the Chicago School goes against that. They're also, the Chicago School, very much against this idea of eugenics. Eugenics comes from, I think, is it Latin? Probably Greek, for good origin or good birth. This is a movement that really has taken strong root by the 1920s. It had begun around 1910. By the 1920s and into the 1930s, you're going to see an embrace of this in the United States. The goal among eugenicists, this idea of good birth, is to breed a better human being. There's a couple ways you can do this, right? You can actually bring people together that have the good traits and mate them, or you can just keep people apart who have negative traits, whatever that means. At any rate, this is eugenics in a nutshell. This is not science class. You don't have to worry about that so much. My point is simply this. The eugenics movement is all about eliminating certain negative traits in society. And so what you're going to see as part of this is a push for anti-miscegenation laws, laws against racial mixing. You're also going to see in the 1920s and 30s forced sterilization of women, or coerced, let me put it that way, sterilization of women, particularly people who are poor. People at this time don't want poor people breeding. They don't want them having children because they believe, a lot of people believe, that poor people will only give birth to more poor people. A lot of people at this time are still decidedly social Darwinistic. The Chicago School is pushing back on that. Point is, these eugenicists believe poor people should not breed, rich people should breed. Also, they believe that what they call the feeble-minded should not breed. The feeble-minded is a term that is used to describe people who are of low intelligence. And of course, when people look at Black people, people of color generally, they will see largely a group of impoverished people, not completely, but largely, especially in the 1920s. And so they will say, well, they're not just Black, but they're poor. They're not just brown, but they're poor. And maybe they don't have the best level of education, so maybe we consider them feeble-minded as well. So this is problematic. Of course, it affects white people too, surely, but people of color are going to be lumped into this poor and feeble-minded category automatically, it seems. In fact, in 1927, the Supreme Court actually is faced with a decision on whether or not it was just for a woman to be sterilized against her will. This woman, in fact, was considered feeble-minded by the definition of the time. And historians, when we look back, we think, well, she was just an uneducated person. Maybe she wasn't really the most she wasn't necessarily the most sophisticated person. That doesn't mean she was feeble-minded. But in 1927, the Supreme Court upholds the forced sterilization of this young woman and other young women, and states are doing this. The Supreme Court at this time, and this is actually a dark period in the time of the Supreme Court. In fact, Oliver Wendell Holmes, who was a Supreme Court justice of great eminence, intelligent, brilliant man who made some really great decisions, he dropped the ball here. I mean, he messed up. He's famous in this decision for writing and upholding, right? He's upholding the sterilization of this, quote, feeble-minded girl, supposedly, and he says of her, because she had been born of people who weren't all that successful, and apparently she was like third in line or something. I can't remember exactly, but here's what he says. He says 3 generations of imbeciles are enough. So cut the cord. Don't let them procreate. Don't let them reproduce anymore. So, I said people of color are often lumped in with the poor and feeble-minded. This forced sterilization was happening into the 20s and 30s of Black women, of Mexican women too. Interestingly, the eugenics movement here will become the basis for Hitler's extermination of millions of people during World War II. It's not going to be just the Jews. It will be, of course, the Roma, which you might know as gypsies, Jehovah's Witnesses, the Polish, the disabled, physically disabled, the mentally disabled. People like me, first of all, right? I'm brown. No way I would have survived under Hitler. My son, who is white as white, there's no way this kid would have survived under Hitler because of his autism. Even though he's highly functional, they would have sought to actually purge the blood pool, right? The gene pool of that kind of trait. So what you're going to see in the 1920s and 30s is a lot of people talking about where they come from and how they're descended from this great lineage, you see. And it's kind of interesting because, nowadays people really love looking back and saying, oh, I am Polish, or I'm this, or I'm that. Back in the 1920s and 30s, people were trying to erase that stuff. They did not want to be thought of as second class, because in fact, it was thought that Anglos and Germans were the brightest, and then everybody else fell somewhere underneath, with black people and brown people at the bottom. It's interesting that this whole eugenics movement took hold in the United States very strongly, and actually influenced to some degree the eugenics movement of Hitler and the Nazi regime. But it's interesting because it was because of Hitler and what he did in the 1930s and 40s that a lot of people in this country would then abandon the eugenics movement. It went too far. So we have a lot of people. Let me get back on track here, because what I was talking about was this embrace of the idea that environmental factors will, in fact, explain the position of people. So you're looking there. So a lot of black leaders are, in fact, looking to explain the condition of people through the sciences and through scholarship. Others are, and so they're pointing to, really what they're trying to do is say, look, every human is capable, and every human community of whatever race is capable. It just has to do with what kind of environment you raise these people in. At the same time that black leaders are doing this, there's also a rising interest in black history and culture. So they're, on the one hand, they're saying it's not black history and culture that is, or it's not black culture and black people's genetics that are problematic. It is the environment. And they will then point to and celebrate the contributions of black people to the formation of the country. So they're going to be more likely to look at black history. They're going to push to celebrate the place of black people, the contributions of black people to the formation of the country. And the guy that we can credit, I think perhaps more than we can others, is a guy named Woodson, which is an educated man himself. He gets a PhD in history from Harvard, like W.B. Du Bois, right? And he will write scholarly books and articles on black people generally, the black life. He will look at the family, the black family, their conditions, their norms, their behaviors. He will look at black religion and how it differs from white religion, and how even among black people, depending on where they are and how they grew up, will in fact demonstrate different religious tendencies or beliefs. He will look at the state of education among black people, the success of black people in the professions. And so he's looking at this from a variety of perspectives, history, of course. And he eventually, in 1922, writes a book. It's called The Negro in Our History. The Negro in Our History. Notice the word our. And so he's talking about the Negro in our history, our meaning the United States, U.S. history. And this textbook is actually read by countless black people, especially students in the historically black colleges and universities, the HBCUs. For this reason, he will be known as the father of black history. And not just for that, but also because he is active in commemorating and celebrating black life. In 1926, for example, he establishes Negro History Week, which in 1976, of course, becomes, let's all say it at once, Black History Month. So for all these reasons, he is considered the father of black history, or Negro history is how they would have said it at the time. But today we would have said black history or African American history. So a growing sense of virtue, I suppose, is being accepted and celebrated with regard to black history, and especially, of course, we're going to see in a moment, Black culture. Countless men and women in the 1920s or 30s, Black men and women, are going to convey their understanding of this emerging Black culture and this emerging Black consciousness. They're going to seek to convey all of that through the arts. And of course, we know what we're talking about here. In the 1920s, it really takes off. It kind of would seem rumblings already in the early years, but in the 1920s, we're going to see the flowering of Black culture through the Harlem Renaissance, where, as I said, men and women will be actually conveying their understanding of Black culture and Black consciousness. We know that it's called the Harlem Renaissance because it was centered in Harlem, New York, which is today still, I think, kind of a Black neighborhood, but not as much. It's been pretty well gentrified, I think, by now. It's been a long time since I've been to Harlem. But Harlem in the 1920s is where Black art flourishes. And it draws Black talent from around the country. It's seen by many Black people as the race capital of Black people, sometimes called the Mecca of the new Negro. This Harlem Renaissance is really a flowering of Black culture. We're talking about visual arts, right? So painting, drawing. We're talking about music, jazz, blues. We're talking about dance, right? The Charleston and other kinds of things. We're talking about literature on the Black experience, literature about Black identity, poetry, like Langston Hughes, and other essays on the Black condition. All of this will really thrive in Harlem, but it really goes beyond Harlem. It spreads to Chicago, and really it resonates in Black urban areas, especially of the North, but throughout the country. These men and women of the Harlem Renaissance, they are embracing the value of Blackness, Africanness. Men like Alain Locke, who talks about the melding of culture and politics. Make sure you read the book on this stuff, right? These people are seeking integration into white society through this vehicle of culture. But what's interesting about these people is that they want acceptance on their own terms. This idea of Black culture for them is that it is decidedly American, quote unquote, because it thrives here. But of course, it has roots in Africa, but roots also extending through slavery, and of course, back to Africa. For them, they think we want to be accepted on our own terms. We are different. We are, as they would have said, African American. We want to be accepted on our own terms. Now, they still appeal to white audiences. So they perform for white audiences, sometimes exclusively white audiences. They actually appeal, and they wish to appeal, not only to white audiences, but to white patrons of the arts, people who will give them money to actually be able to, and patronage in the arts is centuries and centuries old, right? If you are a true artist, the thinking goes, you don't do it for money, but you're a starving artist, but you still need to eat, and you still need someone to finance your art. And so patrons, rich people, you've heard of the term patron of the arts. So rich people will come in and throw money into it. Maybe invest is a better word. Investing in the art as, I guess, an economic product, perhaps, but more so as a cultural product. Now, there are various ways to look at the Renaissance and the art that comes out of it, because not everybody who is part of the Harlem Renaissance or who actually has some affinity, some connection to the Harlem Renaissance, actually agrees on the meaning of art, the meaning and purpose of art. For example, people like W.E.B. Du Bois, he believes that he says all art is propaganda. All art must be used to convey a political message. And Black art has a particular political message. Black art must convince people of the need for Black freedom, the need for Black equality. So he's got his thing. It's like, if you're going to be an artist, then you must convey a political message. It's propaganda. Now, others will say, well, art is actually very personal. But really, I would like for it to reflect the Black struggle, Black successes, the Black condition. So others kind of take this middle ground, because between W.E.B. Du Bois, or after W.E.B. Du Bois, you have these people who are sort of middle of the road, but then we have people on the far side, and most of these are the artists themselves that say, look, art is personal, art is fluid, art should reflect me. And if it brings, if I'm feeling a political message, then so be it. If I'm not, to hell with it. I have nothing to do with that, right? So for a lot of these people who are artists, they believe in art being personal and fluid and reflecting their own personal struggles. And in fact, a lot of these artists at the ground level, they want it to reflect the common Black man, the common Black woman, where, you know, they depict the grittiness, the realness of Black life. These people are shameless about being Black. They're not going to be shamed about their Blackness. For example, Black author, right, Langston Hughes, he says, if white people like us and they like our art, well, then that's good. If not, so what? He says, Black people are beautiful and we're ugly too. So for him, it's all about just this reality of Blackness and how people can define it for themselves. That's what art is. That art is not necessarily propaganda and doesn't necessarily need to be used for uplift or any sort of political purpose. We should embrace it for what it is. Now, of course, we've seen disagreements before, right? W.E.B. Du Bois disagreed with, with Booker T. Washington and so forth. So we have to pay attention to the fact that not all Black people think the same way. They're not a monolith, right? There's no such thing as the Black community, although we try to encapsulate them in this way. And there are some markers, perhaps, that we can point to socially and culturally and politically about the Black community. We have to be careful when, if we ignore the differences, then we're going to lose sight of the whole. Now, a lot of Black people like this idea of political art, but a lot of them don't stop there. They believe the arts are helpful, but they also believe Black people must take political power for themselves. The arts can help that, but let's not go too far with this. They say white people will never accept Black people on their own terms. People will say white people will never accept Black people except if Black people try to fit into the mold that's set for them by white people. That's what they're saying. So they even look at these Black performers of the Harlem Renaissance, and they say, look, you're performing in pretty much in front of all white audiences. These are segregated audiences, and you are standing up there singing and dancing and trying to actually fit into what the whites see of you and how they expect you to behave. Stop trying to please them. They are always looking at you. Do it for yourself. Instead of trying to please white folk, instead of trying to fit their mold, these people say, we must embrace Black nationalism. Black nationalism is going to be seen as a way up. Excuse me. Black nationalism is this idea that Black people are a nation within a nation. If the American nation, so to speak, is a nation, well, Black people are not wholly accepted. They're barely accepted. They're barely tolerated in most places. Therefore, they are a separate nation living within a, quote, American nation. And because of this, they should embrace their African heritage more tightly. We will never be accepted on our own terms, they say. Despite what many people think, despite what Du Bois wants and other Black leaders want, despite what the artists of the Harlem Renaissance are trying to do because they're dealing, with Black audiences and Black patrons, we must band with others of African descent. We are a nation within a nation, and even so, we are more than that. We are part of an African world. So in the 1920s, we get, and I mentioned this before, this growth of Pan-Africanism. And here is a flag. This is a flag of Pan-Africanism. The idea that Black people are connected no matter where in the world they live. Okay. Now, of course, this takes us back a little bit to what I said a moment ago about there not being a monolith, but there is something to this idea of Black nationalism and this idea of Black togetherness and a sense of camaraderie and family, perhaps, that exists among Black people, though not everybody subscribes to that. We have to recognize that, right? But these people who are embracing this idea of Pan-Africanism, the idea that the problem of Black people in this country is the problem of Black people around the world, these people are looking to celebrate Blackness and, in fact, redeem Blackness from what it has been thought of in the past. And they want to separate from white society in order to do so. They don't want to try to fit into white society. These people are what you call Black separatists, meaning they want Black separation. They don't want civil rights. They don't want integration. They want separation. They call it separation, not segregation. Why? Segregation is when you do it to me. Separation is what I want to do to you. Separate myself from you. So these people are thinking, we've tried. We've had centuries of trying. We had the Civil War. Then we had, of course, Reconstruction. And then Jim Crow. And, then the Black migration. And none of this seems to be helping. Therefore, and of course, even with their participation in World War I, it doesn't seem to help. So these people say, let's separate out. Now, these ideas are embodied in the UNIA. The UNIA is one of several organizations just like it, right? These sort of, very Pan-Africanist, very separatist, and this idea of Blackness rising. They are one of them, the UNIA, but they are the largest and the most militant. The UNIA is the Universal Negro Improvement Association. It forms in 1916 and is founded actually in Jamaica, right? Not Jamaica, Queens, Jamaica, the Caribbean, by a guy named Marcus Garvey. Marcus Garvey, make sure you read this guy in your book. This guy is born in Jamaica. He travels the Caribbean. He travels South America. And everywhere he goes in these areas, he sees the brutal exploitation of workers, especially dark-skinned workers, Black and brown people. And so he becomes a mover and a shaker. He becomes an organizer of labor unions. He goes around the world. He speaks at places like London, where he talks about the oppression of people and about the pride of Black people. This guy is unapologetically Black. And he decries, meaning he disdains, he looks down at what Black people are doing in the United States in the 1920s, and some places around the world. In the 1920s, what has become fashionable actually is things like skin lightening among Black folk. You will see a variety of products that are marketed to Black people to make their skin lighter. So this is just one such ad. There's a multitude of them. And you will see this all the way through the 1950s, all over the place. They're also engaging in hair straightening. So, for example, you have organizations or companies like G.A. Morgan's heavy hair pressing comb, right? He sells a comb that will help straighten the Afro hair. And this is something that takes off, right? After 1906, already by the 1920s, you're seeing a lot of stars, a lot of people within the Harlem Renaissance movement actually doing this, improving their appearance, so to speak, through straightening their hair, lightening their skin. This is a picture of one of those hot combs that they called them. And if you've ever read, if you ever read the autobiography of Malcolm X, Malcolm X used to do this too, and he talks about how he was, straightening his hair and really denying his blackness and so forth. But he gives an account of how much this process hurt when he did it the first time, how much it burned his scalp, and it can actually destroy your hair. But there they were, and the finished product looks something like this. This was called the conch, which was big in the early 1900s, especially the 1920s and 30s, even into the 40s, where you have men who straighten out their hair. Notice he's quite light skinned. So people would say, you're going for this white man look. And people like Marcus Garvey are saying, you hate yourself. Now, I'm not judging. I'm not saying he was right or that he was wrong. What I'm saying is that, again, you have another example of how people who are black are looking at things differently, right? You have people like Josephine Baker, who also does something. This is called, not conking, but I think they call it marcelling or something when it was women. It doesn't matter. The point is hair straightening, right? Josephine Baker, who was a star on the stage, who became famous for her dance, right? She was seen as very exotic, and she moved like no other woman moved, and people were astounded and aghast and horrified in some instances, but somehow so sexually titillated, right? And she would perform around the world, and she ended up living in France though, because she didn't have a great experience here in the 1920s and 30s. Later on, interestingly, she becomes a spy for the French in World War II. That's pretty cool. But this is the 1920s and 30s, and so here she is, and talk about risque, right, for the era. And she would perform these sorts of primitive, I suppose, is from the point of view of white observers of the time, primitive dances, right? And so people like Marcus Garvey looked at this and said, oh, no, 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 right? He wants to push back on all that. Now, just really quickly, talking about skin lightening, talking about straightening of hair, that is still an issue in the black community today. There are still products out there for this. There are a lot of black women, of course, who straighten their hair, and in the eyes of some people are considered, I don't know what word to use, maybe traitors, I don't know. But of course, these women who straighten their hair, they're thinking, look, I'm just doing my own thing. I'm not trying to be white. I'm just trying to be me in my own way. And so, I'm not one to judge. And so the point is that these issues are still with us in the black community. There's a movie, I think it was called Black Hair. I think it has Chris Rock in it. I think it's called Black Hair. Really, really cool, sort of entertaining documentary. At any rate, skin lightening, hair straightening. Marcus Garvey pushes back on all that, and his move. He's like, no, his movement is sort of a precursor to the Black is Beautiful movement that we will see in the 60s, where he will say, no, do not lighten your skin, do not straighten your hair. And in fact, he sees a lot of the black elites like W.E.B. Du Bois, he sees them as compromisers. Now, a lot of the black elites, W.E.B. Du Bois and even Woodson and some of these other guys, they tend to be very light-skinned. They seek to work within the system. And he's like, no, I'm not having any of this. He basically, doesn't really call them traitors necessarily, but he believes that, or maybe he does, I just don't know, but he does believe that black leaders must embrace blackness. And because of this, and that black people generally should be prompted to embrace blackness. And this invigorates black people in Harlem and around the world. This guy gives speeches, very powerful speeches. He gives these grand parades where he's decked out in this uniform, kind of like a grand master kind of something or another, right? Very reminiscent of old Europe, where he's decked out, but at the same time, he's appealing to the common folk, right? So his movement is very much a grassroots movement. Grassroots just means, from the bottom up, right? He's not about catering to the black elites. He's about catering to the common folk, the black masses. And he invigorates them. and he gives these huge speeches, and he's kind of highfalutin, and he's got this reputation for being a bit of a, I don't know, ostentatious, arrogant dandy, but he does get nearly two, I mean, it works because by 1921, there are nearly 2 million UNIA members, of which he is the head. Now, today, people still hold parades in his honor. Various cities across the country celebrate Marcus Garvey, and they do hold parades and sometimes dress like him. Now, Garvey himself, he eventually fails. See the book for that. But his movement lays the basis for change. The change is this idea that there is a sense of pride in Black identity. There is a sense of empowerment, and that will take hold in the coming decades. And you have to ask, why is it that so many people are embracing Black nationalism with its ideas of separatism? Why is it that people embrace that? Well, and I think I forgot to mention something about Marcus Garvey, and that is he embraces economic, what he calls an economic nationalism, right? His main goal is for Black people to own their own businesses and factories, their own schools, and to cater to each other via their professions. Remember, he's a separatist, and he believes that in order to separate, you have to have your own economy. So he has this economic nationalism thing going. And of course, he wants a safe place for Black people to live. When he talks about separatism, he wants them to have their own country, away from people of the United States who don't want them. And in a sense, this reminds me a little bit about the push by the Jews to have their own state of Israel, which they do now. From the Jews' perspective, they said we need our own country, our own state, so that we can protect our own interests, because historically, wherever we go, we are persecuted. That was true. Just as it's true for the Black people at this time in the 1920s. They could have said the same thing, right? Everywhere we go, we're persecuted. We want our own country. And so a lot of people will embrace this. And interestingly, a lot of them begin embracing the idea of racial purity. Now, no, most people in the country don't, but a lot of them do. Again, he's got like 2 million members. But his racial purity actually turns a lot of people off, because he, at one point, he even meets with the KKK. He meets with the leaders of the KKK because they have the same goal. They want to live apart. They have their own ideas of racial purity, and so does he. And he's like, hey, I get you. So he draws a lot of attention, and a lot of Black leaders like W.E.B. Du Bois call him dangerous. But it's also because so many people embrace him. And if you think about why, I mean, look at the history, right? Look at the history of slavery. Look at the violence during Reconstruction, Jim Crow that came after. Look at the riots after the war, the destruction of Tulsa, Oklahoma in 1921, a century ago. In fact, there's a podcast that I posted that you should hear. Now, a lot of people are embracing this, but not all Black people do. Most people in the country who are Black just want to do their own thing. We must remember that Black people are not a monolithic community. Many of them are simply working to improve their lives and really to improve the lives of people around them, whoever they are. And I'm going to give you an example here. And I bring this guy up because I grew up really knowing about him because he's from Cleveland, or at least that's where he makes his name. Originally from Kentucky, but he moves to Cleveland as a young boy. And by the early 1900s, Garrett Morgan will become a brilliant inventor. This guy is the inventor of the first three signal traffic light, 3-light traffic signal. His signal actually gives a warning that the light is about to change, right? And that cars are going to be expected to stop pretty soon, kind of like the yellow light today. I'm not sure it used a yellow light, but there was a warning between green and red, right? And so he's actually the first guy to come up with this 3-light traffic signal, and it is in Cleveland in the Euclid Avenue, 115th and Euclid, something like that. not too far from where I grew up, where this traffic light is first installed in the early 1900s. He's actually the first black man in Cleveland to own a car. That's how he comes up with the idea. He's driving around and he sees the kinds of traffic devices that are out there, and he's like, I can do this better. And he does. So this is a huge one. He also comes up with something else, which he calls the safety hood, which is really a gas mask. Of course, not what we would consider to be very handy today. I mean, handy in the sense that it worked, but not necessarily very portable. He actually invents the gas mask. He has trouble selling it first. He's trying to sell it to fire stations, like in Cleveland and other places. And he goes out and he demonstrates it himself. But very few people want to buy an invention from a black man, even though it works. He actually has to, later on, he hires a white actor to pretend he is the inventor. Garrett Morgan goes along with this white actor to pretend, the white actor is pretending he's the inventor, and Garrett Morgan is pretending to be his sidekick, actually being the one who actually demonstrates it, while the white actor talks about his quote unquote invention. At one point, actually, Morgan dresses up as a Native American sidekick. He dresses himself up as Big Chief Mason, and so he's thought of as Native American rather than black. He is pretty light-skinned, and then people actually start to buy it, but people are still not sure. It's a new invention, and then something happens in 1916. Something happens under Lake Erie. Lake Erie, of course, Cleveland sits on Lake Erie, on the edge there. And Lake Erie, a lot of people don't know this. It's a huge lake. It's one of the Great Lakes. But Lake Erie and other Great Lakes, like Lake Erie, I think, but Lake Erie for sure, has underneath it a bunch of tunnels and salt mines. That lake sits above open channels that have been dug out. It's amazing. And so in 1916, the city is digging a new tunnel. Maybe they're digging for salt. I don't know. But Cleveland gets a lot of salt from there. In fact, the Morton Company is based there still, I think. Morton Salt. But they're digging, the city is digging a new tunnel 4 miles offshore and 120 feet or so below the surface. So that's out there and below there, right? So the city's mining out there, and the men hit a pocket of gas. When they hit this pocket of gas, an explosion just rips through, trapping workers underground. These guys are underground. They're surrounded by gas. They're surrounded by fumes. In the early hours of the morning, Garrett gets a call. We need your help. He and his brother, Frank, they put on these safety hoods, and they go down, and after several hours underground, he and his brother and other men actually end up saving several trapped workers, and they recover the bodies of others. The mayor of Cleveland thanks him for what he has done. Unfortunately, the local newspapers leave his name out of it. Cleveland Plain Dealer, the Cleveland Press, and other newspapers, well, those are the biggies at the time, they leave his name out of it. And in fact, there's an award ceremony given later on. I think it was like Carnegie Endowment Hero, something. I don't know. Doesn't matter. But there's an official award ceremony for heroes of this incident. And they don't give him or his brother an award. So this guy's contributing. He saves lives. And in fact, this is the first time any sort of gas mask has been used in action. He will sell it to the U.S. military for its use during the World War I, and later on will sell the patent to a company. I think it was General Electric. So today we have the gas mask because of him. Not to say that it wouldn't have been invented otherwise, but he did it. He gets no credit for it for a very, very long time. And I think it's not until the 1960s or 70s that he actually begins to get credit in Cleveland itself. And I wonder if anybody listening to this has actually ever heard of that. If you have, shoot me an email. I'm curious to know if you feel like it. Maybe you have a Cleveland connection. Anyway, what's interesting about this guy is that he actually, and you might be familiar with this, I showed you this a moment ago, talk about improving your appearance. If you look down to the bottom left-hand corner, it says the G.A. Morgan. Well, that stands for Garrett Morgan Hair Refining Company. This guy, in fact, is the guy. I don't know if he's the only guy, but he comes up with the hair straightening formula, right? He develops some chemical that straightens out very, very kinky curly hair, right? As in the afro. He tested on the friend of a. I'm sorry, I almost said the friend of a dog. The dog of a friend, and that owner, who this friend doesn't believe it's the same dog because it comes back like straight hair. His formula sells, and it encourages the trend of hair straightening, right? So we can look at it and think, oh, he was part of this whole thing, but that's the only way he's able to finance all his other inventions. He finances it with the money that he gets from this hair straightening formula, this hair refining company. And I found this fascinating because I just found this the other day. If you look at the very bottom, it says 5204 Harlem Avenue. That is actually just one street over from where I grew up in Cleveland. I grew up at 5319 Luther Avenue in Cleveland, Ohio. And that's not a very good area. Google Earth it if you like. Tell me what you think. Not that you actually care that much, but it just I don't know. I think it's so cool because I grew up in this area, and in fact, that's where Garrett Morgan on the next street over on Harlem. My friends lived on Harlem. That's where his whole company was. Anyway, this is a man descended from slaves who's gonna become what he called himself, the Black Edison. Maybe Edison should have called himself the White Morgan. I don't know. There are other people like this guy, inventors, scientists, teachers, lawyers, ordinary men and women who are just trying to make their way in society as society is changing, and they're hoping for change, although, of course, we know that it's changing very slowly. Still, it seems like the new Negro is rising, but just as the new Negro seems to be rising, something happens. The nation encounters the greatest catastrophe has ever met since the Civil War. Of course, we're talking about the Great Depression. And we will talk about that next time. Thank you for listening. Be well and be good.